Sorry if you heard that. Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Isabel Fryett, and I'm a fourth-year sociology major. Today, I will be talking about my research, which is examining the effects of screen violence exposure on benevolent and hostile sexism. I conducted this research as a capstone project submitted for graduation with university honors, and I conducted this research with my amazing faculty mentor, Dr. Amy Kruska. So the purpose of this study is to show the effects of non-sexual violence on sexist attitudes. Past studies have shown that exposure to violence against women in the media that has a positive sexual outcome increases men's likelihood of harassing and assaulting women. This was a pattern that did not hold for women. They also show that people who have a history of exposure to this type of media are more likely to adopt these attitudes if attitudes will positively benefit them. This is a pattern that is stronger for men than it is for women. A history of exposure to media portrayals of stereotypical gender attitudes increases male and female agreement with said stereotypes about gender. And while most studies focus on violence in media with male perpetrators and female victims, and it also focuses on violence with sexual outcome, we don't know the effects of non-sexual violence against both men and women in both the perpetrator and victim roles. So here are my research questions. I first wanted to answer if short-term exposure to non-sexual violent media influences benevolent and hostile sexism. I then wanted to see how a history of long-term exposure affects benevolent and hostile sexism. And then lastly, I wanted to see if a history of exposure moderates the effects of immediate exposure on those attitudes. Now, you may be wondering, what is benevolent and hostile sexism? Benevolent sexism is sexist attitudes that emphasize a man's role in protecting and providing for a woman by putting them on a pedestal. This protection is given in exchange for a woman's compliance to traditional gender roles. Hostile sexism is sexist attitudes that negatively view individuals who violate traditional gender roles. And both are marked with paternalism, which is relating to others in a manner of a father dealing with a child, gender differentiation, which is a woman claiming benefits as wives and caregivers, while men claim benefits as providers and earners, and ideals of heterosexual intimacy, which is a mutual dependency and vulnerability in both a man and a woman. So drawing on social learning theory, this theory states that actions that have a positive consequence are more likely to be repeated. Studies that draw on this theory suggest that individuals who are repeatedly exposed to violence in media where one is rewarded for violence increases the likelihood of adopting attitudes that favor that kind of behavior. So violent media portrayals that have a positive reward for people doing negative actions against women reinforce the idea that those actions will be rewarded in real life. Studies that I have reviewed are consistent with these predictions, showing that exposure to negative treatment of women increases acceptance to violence and negativity towards women. So here are my three hypotheses. The first is an exposure to images of violence against women will increase both benevolent and hostile sexist attitudes. The second is a history of exposure to violent media will increase both benevolent and hostile sexist attitudes. And the third is a history of exposure to violent media will moderate the effect of exposure to images of violence against women on sexist attitudes. More specifically, that history will increase the positive effect of short-term exposure on sexist attitudes. So the reason there's no hypothesis relating to male victims is because there are very few studies that can lead me to hypothesize about the effects of male victimization. So while I also examine the effects of exposure to male victimization on violent media, I do not advance hypotheses for the effects of that kind of exposure. So onto my methodology. I sampled 270 participants using Amazon Mechanical Turk, or MTurk, and it was restricted to those in the United States to control for possible international differences and those over the age of 18. Here's my participant demographic. So age is measured in years, gender was dichotomized with female and non-binary, while male was omitted. Education level is also dichotomized with bachelor's degree or higher, with associate's degree and lower omitted. Sexual orientation is represented with 2 dummies, bisexual and heterosexual, with everything else omitted. Race and ethnicity is represented with 3 dummies, Black, Latinx, and other, with white omitted. Marital status is represented with 5 dummies, cohabiting, divorced, separated, never married, and other, with married omitted. And political conservatism was reported on a 101-point slider ranging from extremely liberal to extremely conservative. The participants were then exposed to a 34-second video, which was one of 6 videos. These videos showed 20 seconds of violence and 14 seconds of a blank screen, and they were randomly assigned to one of 6 conditions. Here are my 6 conditions. They are male on male violence, female on female violence, male on female violence, female on male violence, with 2 controls, non-gendered violence and no violence. These conditions are compilations of clips from YouTube put together and edited to hide the gender of either the victim, the assailant, or both. I'm going to play you the male on male condition to help further explain the composition of these conditions. Can you see a blank screen? Okay. So as you saw in the video, some of the faces were covered by a black box. This was to ensure that all participants in the experimental conditions were exposed to the same images and that they only viewed the faces of the victims and the aggressors that matched their condition. So each condition was shown the exact same 4 video clips, just different faces were covered. So in the male on male violence condition, all of the female faces were covered, as you saw. In the female on female violence condition, all male faces were covered. In the male on female violence condition, all the female aggressive faces were covered and all the male victim faces were covered. In the female on male violence condition, all of the male aggressive faces were covered and all the female victim faces were covered. In the non-gendered violence condition, everyone's faces were covered. And in the no violence condition, it contained different clips of people walking and animals and different videos that had no violence whatsoever. So for the long-term exposure, I used a modified version of the exposure to media violence scale to judge their history of exposure to violent media. I operationalized exposure to violent media by taking the sum of two identical items, one for weekdays and one for weekend days. So for this question, I asked the participants how many hours per day did they typically spend watching TV shows, movies, and other media, with 6 different response options ranging from 0 hours to 14 plus hours. I then asked what percentage of TV shows, movies, and other media they watched that included physical violence, shooting, or killing, with 5 different response options ranging from 0% to 100%. So I took those first 2 questions relating to the hours, and I multiplied that by the percentage of screen time that is violent in order to create the history of exposure variable. The participants were then asked to rate 12 different statements taken from the ambivalent sexism inventory. So I used a modified version of the ASI because I only used the ambivalent attitudes about women scale and none of the statements from the male focus scale. These 12 questions were then used to create my 2 dependent variables. For my dependent variables, I applied principal components factors analysis with Varimax with Kaiser normalization and found 2 factors, benevolent sexism and hostile sexism. I then summed the loaded items for each of the factors and used those sums as my dependent variables. So here is my factor analysis. And as you can see, the bolded loadings, so the bolding numbers in the left column are benevolent and those in the right column are hostile. So as I said in my previous slide, I summed the loaded items for each of the factors, which are the bolded numbers, and used those sums as my dependent variables. Here are my results for my OLS regression of benevolent sexism. So all of these models are controlled for whether or not the participant passed the attention checks. And as you can see, I have 4 models here. One model will not be shown in depth, and that is model 3. In model 3, I investigated hypothesis 3 by examining the interactions of the history exposure variable with the conditions, and it produced 5 non-significant interaction effects. I don't present them here because the models are too big for the screen, but if you would like to see them, I am happy to show you the models through email. So in model 1, it includes just my conditions and the attention checks. Model 1 shows, contrary to hypothesis 1, female victimization does not increase benevolent sexism as shown by the non-significant coefficients. It also shows a decrease in benevolent sexism on the male-on-male violence condition. This is my second model. Model 2 includes history of exposure to violent media variable. And it is consistent with hypothesis 2 because it shows a history of exposure to violent media is positively associated with benevolent sexism. This is model 4. Model 4 contains participant attributes age, gender, education level, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, marital status, and political conservatism, but this model does not include the interaction effects. Model 4 shows that a history of exposure holds even with participant attributes holding it constant. But as you can see, it does decline in size from 1.47 to 0.742, but it remains a significant predictor. So in my results for benevolent sexism, I had two non-findings. The first being female victimization did not increase benevolent sexism. This could be potentially because of short exposure and or the inability to conceal gender of the aggressor and the victim in the non-featured video. The second non-finding is male-on-male violence condition decreased benevolent sexism. I'm not too sure of the origin of this. This basically means that those who view this condition see women as more independent, and this is an unexpected finding that definitely needs more research. It could be a methodological glitch where I could not fully conceal the faces well enough and unexpectedly had a decline in benevolent sexism on this condition. So here are my results for my OLS regression of hostile sexism. All of the models again controlled for whether or not the participants passed the attention checks, and model 3 is shown here, but it will not be shown in depth. Model 1 again includes just my conditions and attention checks, and it is contrary to hypothesis 1 because female victimization does not increase hostile sexism as shown by the non-significant coefficients. This is my second model. Model 2 again includes the history of exposure to violent media variable, and again it is consistent with hypothesis 2, showing that a history of exposure to violent media is positively associated with hostile sexism. This is model 4. Model 4 again contains the participant attributes, age, gender, education level, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, marital status, and political conservatism, but again does not include the interaction effects. Model 4 shows that a history of exposure to violent media holds even with participant attributes holding it constant, and again it does decline in size from 1.57 to 0.746, but remains a significant predictor. So I had one non-finding for hostile sexism, that being that female victimization did not increase hostile sexism. Again, this could be caused by too short of an exposure and or the inability to conceal the gender of the aggressor and the victim in the non-featured video. So my results conclusion. In conclusion, hypothesis 1 was not supported, meaning that the short exposure to female victimization did not increase benevolent or hostile sexism. Hypothesis 2 was supported, meaning that history of exposure to violent media did increase both benevolent and hostile sexism. And lastly, hypothesis 3 was not supported, meaning a history of exposure did not moderate the effect of immediate exposure to violence against women on benevolent and hostile sexism. So some of my limitations, which I've already mentioned, one being it was too short of an exposure. So probably with longer exposure, there would have been a greater increase in sexism on the conditions. So it just means that 20 seconds of exposure was probably a bit too short to show an effect. And then the gender covering issues. So as you saw in the video, the black boxes were quite large. So this could have probably caused issues or distractions or not actually concealed the gender of the non-featured video. So in the future, better editing software is definitely needed in order to conceal the true gender of the people in the video clips. So this study differs from others because it looks at non-sexual violent media on benevolent and hostile sexism. It looks at differing gendered victims and aggressors. So with further direction, I think it's important to look deeper into the effects of male and female victims and aggressors in violent media. There really isn't a lot of research looking at male victims in sexual and non-sexual violent media, which I do think is an important factor in attitudes toward gender. And there also needs to be more research done on female aggressors on both male and female victims to see how our attitudes toward gender are affected by seeing an aggressive, violent women in media. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Isabel. That was great.